Hello everyone, John the Morgile here, gonna do a flat earth video for you guys. Hope you enjoy it. Getting right into it, all of the arguments which supposedly provide us with conclusive proof of the spinning ball Earth have indeed been thoroughly refuted, proving to be an utter embarrassment for the globe Earth proponents. Our culture is one that collectively believes the absurd theory that the world is a spinning ball flying around in outer space. While this theory is wholly unbelievable to a rational mind, one that was somehow never sullied by the mandatory federal curriculum, designed in large part to create entire generations of mindless drones subservient to a system that ensures perpetual consumerism and statism. It is my belief that the widespread deception of the sphere Earth provides the necessary framework to transform society from generally empathetic to completely selfish and capitalist. Surely the television is among the primary delivery mechanisms through which the secret brotherhood externalizes their agenda upon the masses, second only perhaps to the educational system, although that statement is certainly up for debate. The fundamental belief that our world is, in the grand scheme of things, irrelevant, mediocre, and accidental. Thus, by direct extension, we are systematically led to believe that life in general is insignificant, mediocre, and accidental. This underlying matrix of the standard belief system primes our culture with the necessary paradigm to produce the desired, obedient, docile slave class who provide services to the extremely wealthy, content with the table scraps of the elite, and of course the beer, bread, and circus, as they say, to keep us entertained and distracted. The time is fast approaching when the majority of the jobs supporting the middle class completely vanish for Americans and eventually the people worldwide, as more and more jobs are replaced by robots and software. Picture a world where truck drivers no longer exist, as a simple software upgrade will soon allow AI to replace every single truck driving job in the world. Of course, software doesn't need to sleep, eat, or use the bathroom, nor does software call in sick. Software doesn't need medical benefits or potentially, drink a few cold beers with their chili dog. Now, there are about 3.5 million truckers in the United States, out of around 325 million people total in the United States. Now, that's a little bit more than 1% of the population are truck drivers. That is an absolutely staggering number of people, and a staggering percentage of the population who are truck drivers. Now, most of these people have families relying on them, so the number of people in the United States directly dependent upon income generated by driving big rigs is certainly in the tens of millions. And let's not forget the industries which are indirectly dependent upon the shipping industry. Gas stations and convenience stores, restaurants, hotels, and all sorts of vendors are only in business because of the truckers. Now, the moment that software becomes safer than a human driver, and I think that moment is already here, and the technology is cost effective to implement, I predict that we're going to see a massive dump of literally 1% of the population into the unemployment line. And the chain reaction of businesses that cater largely to truckers shutting their doors all over the place would be inevitable. This instance is an illustration of how corporations are the epitome of psychopathic, as they are completely void of any and all humanity. Corporations are strictly concerned with increasing their profit margin and will step on as many heads as necessary to achieve their goals. Now, at the same time, they must present themselves to the world as wholesome, safe, and deeply concerned with their environment, and of course with their public image. But in reality, all corporations are essentially greedy bloodsuckers that would definitely juice every dollar out of you, the consumer, for a product which costs them, well, as little as possible to either attain or produce. This is, of course, the capitalist mindset, which is among the fundamental linchpins of the Western paradigm, if not the primary cornerstone of the Western worldview. Buy low, sell high means profit for me, but it necessarily means that someone else, somewhere, usually the consumer, is losing value in such transactions, as wealth doesn't just magically appear from nowhere. Or does it? That is, of course, a topic for another discussion, but suffice to say that the Federal Reserve Bank, or I really should say the non-federal, non-reserve, non-bank, is the number one domestic enemy ever to face the American people, and for a large part, most Americans simply do not want to hear about the astonishing truth surrounding the Federal Reserve, primarily because they believe it is some kooky conspiracy theory which has been debunked, so it's not worth the time to even consider. Either that, or they simply don't see how this affects their daily life, or they cannot see what they could do to change anything if they cared enough to try. So it's a topic not worth spending much energy on, according to the average person. Now, anyone with either of these excuses appears to not understand the overall nature of this problem, which may indeed be the case. It could, however, be the result of our lifelong programming and indoctrination into the belief in infinite space and millions of spherical worlds in our galaxy alone that is to blame for such excuses. By the way, the concept of other galaxies far, far away was first purported in 1929 by Edwin Hubble, who apparently saw very tiny lights in the night sky in his telescope, and via absolute conjecture and theory, Hubble deemed, nay, decreed, these tiny distant spirals of light were home to many suns, just as the alleged Milky Way galaxy is, which comprises the vast majority of lights visible to the naked eye, allegedly, according to the standard model. Most of the visible stars we can see with the naked eye belong to the so-called Milky Way galaxy. Now, according to the standard model, the stars visible at night during the summer, say north of the galactic equator, this should be a completely different set of stars compared to those visible at night during the winter, south of the galactic equator. This is owing to the allegation that the Sun's orbit is centered around some point in the center of the hypothetical Milky Way galaxy, and our world's alleged orbit around the Sun is about 60 degrees offset to that. It is often argued by Globers that we do indeed have exclusive stars to specific seasons. However, they are missing the point. Excluding any stars in the far north or far southern skies, the stars, particularly overhead the equatorial areas, should be absolutely exclusive to specific seasons. The fact of the matter is, we can see many such equatorial stars from season to season, which is absolutely contrary to the standard globe Earth infinite space model. We should have complete, unique skies altogether when comparing winter to summer in the standard model, at least when considering such equatorial stars. The fact of the matter is, observable reality does not match this theory. The fact that we can see many of the same equatorial stars from season to season is conclusive proof negative against the ball Earth theory. If any such above described equatorial stars or constellations are visible from season to season, the ball Earth theory simply cannot account for such observations and must be discarded as a failed hypothesis. This glaring problem with the ball Earth astronomy isn't the only such issue of this magnitude where the ball Earth infinite space hypothesis fails to match observable reality. We have all been conditioned to believe the Earth is a spinning ball flying around in space ever since we were old enough to formulate a complete sentence. Thus, it is extremely difficult to convince an educated person to even consider the possibility of a flat and motionless Earth. It is equally difficult for well-educated adults to skeptically examine the globe Earth theory, which has more holes in it than Subway Jarrett's belt. It is simply inconceivable to the average normal person that the entire institution of theoretical science, also known as conjectural alliance, is a complete farce, at least since the time of Einstein, when experiment and observable reality were altogether abandoned and replaced with the elusive scab called thought experiment. Basically, Einstein's imagination was somehow sufficient to supplant experiment and observable reality. Furthermore, Einstein apparently stole many of the equations and theories which made him famous, but he was of course propped up by the mainstream media, and apparently for good reason, to their agenda. Never in history had a theoretical scientist, aka a liaretical hyperbolist, risen to the ranks of superstardom as did Mr. Albert Einstein. His meteoric rise was allegedly resulting from his papers outlining first special and then general relativity, which was a direct response to the staggering results of then recent experiments which proved the Earth to be at rest. I did a quick web search in researching this video, with the keyword being Einstein quote, change the facts, end quote. Most of you are probably familiar with the quote accredited to Einstein, which goes, quote, if the facts don't fit the theory, change the theory, but too often it's easier to keep the theory and change the facts, end quote. Now, apparently there is some debate as to whether or not Einstein actually made this statement, or maybe he was taken out of context, or the statement was potentially altered to some extent. Now, this sort of tactic is so very typical when it comes to controlling the overall public conversation of a given topic. Let's say, hypothetically, that this alleged Einstein quote was knowingly misrepresented on the internet in various popular and underground platforms alike. The conspiracy communities would predictably jump all over such a quote and use it as more ammunition against Einstein, for which there is already plenty of evidence to support the claim that Einstein was, at best, a paid patsy of sorts, and at worst was a deliberate swindler. The latter becomes more and more realistic when you look into Einstein's past as a patent clerk, where he apparently stole the work of people submitting their ideas for patents. At any rate, when the conspiracy community at large uses illegitimate quotes from Einstein, if it happens to be the case in this example, it casts the topic in an unfavorable light to the neutral passerby, and in the mind of the majority of people just being introduced to the topic, it has been debunked, as Einstein never made that quote, apparently. Now, the problem is, whether or not Einstein actually made that comment, it does indeed perfectly encapsulate what Einstein actually did when it comes to theoretically changing the mechanisms of gravitational theory, or the relativity theory. Several experiments prior to the postulation of Einstein's relativity theories were yielding results which showed the Earth to be at rest, lacking any and all axial rotation and orbital velocities. Now, such data is terrifying to the theoretical physicists of the world, who enjoy the unique benefit of having their so-called work exist in a realm where facts or actuality hold no bearing on their postulations. Now, what other field of so-called science can one's assertions be free of any sort of cross-examination or verification? As mentioned earlier, Edwin Hubble came up with the theory that we live in one of trillions of galaxies in the vast hypothetical universe. Now, he postulated that the spirals visible through the largest telescope in the world at the time, the Hooker telescope at the University of California, where Hubble happened to be at the time. So, is it just a coincidence that a man who was apparently a Freemason, which is a secret society that swears its members to secrecy about any given subject that the lodge deems necessary, lest the initiate be buried to his neck at the shoreline during low tide, and all sorts of other nasty stuff, which prevents the Blue Lodge brothers from exposing Freemasonry's secrets? Not that the neophytes would be privy to the lodge's overall goals and schemes, however. On its surface, Freemasonry appears to the uninitiated and to the neophytes within the Brotherhood alike to be a wholesome, philanthropic, social organization. Well, indeed, the majority of Freemasons belong to what's called the Blue Lodge, comprised of Freemasons from the first 3 degrees of the craft. But as one delves deeper into the annals of Freemasonry, it appears to be a nefarious fraternal organization with really deep pockets and limitless power, and masters of the primary mechanism of its camouflage, which is, of course, secrecy. Secret societies akin to Freemasonry are largely based on occult ritual stemming from Arabic rites as well as the Talmud and Kabbalah. Such multifaceted secret societies effectively keep secrets from their very initiates simply by giving the neophytes false understanding of the underlying meanings of their mantras and rituals, but they falsely lead them to believe that they have a firm and healthy understanding of the same tenets of the craft, and that is paraphrasing from Albert Pike from his book Morals and Dogma. The dubious framework of the Dark Brotherhood is arguably the basis for all modern cultures, and is in the process of gobbling up the remaining bastions of the old world, which was, at very least, in harmony and in balance with nature. The creators of the Declaration of Independence and other such documents believed to be designed to protect we the people were predominantly written by Freemasons. While this is rather well known, a similar tidbit which is conspicuously absent from the mainstream educational system is the fact that George Washington was not the first president of the United States, and indeed under the Articles of Confederation and the Continental Congress there were 7 men who served as president prior to George Washington. This is why he is accredited with this quote where they asked him when he became president, "What should we call you?" And he said, "Well, just call me Mr. President." It's because there were already several presidents prior to him. Now, perhaps George Washington was the first president that was bound by secret oaths to keep the goals of the Brotherhood paramount in their priorities, but hidden from the chattel or the rest of us. It's clear that bribery and the ever-looming threat of various brutal deaths, depending on what rank the Freemason happens to be at the time, amount to a sort of passive extortion, if you will. Some excerpts from actual Freemasonic oaths while still in the Blue Lodge go as follows, quote, "To all of which I do solemnly and sincerely promise and swear, without any hesitation, mental reservation, or secret evasion of mind in me whatsoever, binding myself under no less a penalty than that of having," for the entered apprentice degree, it goes, "my throat cut across, my tongue torn out, and with my body buried in the sands of the sea at lower water mark, where the tide ebbs and flows twice in a 24-hour period, should I ever knowingly or willfully violate this, my solemn obligation of an entered apprentice." If they're in the fellow craft or 2nd degree, they say that they would have their left breast torn open, their heart and vitals taken thence, and with their body given as a prey to the vultures of the air, should they ever knowingly or willfully violate this, their solemn obligation of a fellow craft. And finally, the Master Mason degree. This is the 3rd level of the Blue Lodge. They say that they will have their bodies severed in twain, their bowels taken thence, and with their body burned to ashes, and the ashes thereof scattered to the 4 winds of heaven, that there might remain neither a track, trace, nor remembrance among man or masons of so vile and perjured a wretch as I should be, should they ever knowingly or willfully violate this, their solemn obligation of a Master Mason. So when you have 2 presidential nominees, for example, who were both members of the exact same fraternal brotherhood during their time at Yale, that would be Skull and Bones in the case of George W. Bush Jr. and John Kerry during the 2004 election, there is a blatant conflict of interest, as we were going to be stuck with someone who is allegiant first and foremost to their lodge, and only appear to be concerned with their allegiance to their constituents on the exterior, but not really. And of course, Skull and Bones is the same organization that has really bizarre rituals for its ceremonies, And people that attend Yale complain of the noises coming from their on-campus lodge. And in fact, an undercover camera was able to get a peek inside of one of their ceremonies. So I guess they climbed to the rooftop of the lodge and filmed one of these really bizarre rituals. And that clip is rolling in the background right now. And let's not forget, Tim Russert interviewed both Bush and Kerry in the run-up to the 2004 elections. And he did indeed ask them about Skull and Bones, and both of them dodged the question and basically played stupid and said they weren't even sure whether or not it existed.
You were both in Skull and Bones, the secret society.
It's so secret we can't talk about it.
What does that mean for America? The conspiracy theorists are going to go
I'm
on.
sure they are. I don't know. I haven't seen the web.
Number 322?
First of all, he's not the nominee. And, look, I look forward...
Are you prepared to lose?
No, I'm not going to lose.
You both were members of Skull and Bones, a secret society at Yale. What does that tell us?
Not much, because it's a secret.
Is there a secret handshake? Is there a secret code?
I wish there were something secret I could manifest.
322, secret number?
There are all kinds of secrets, Tim, but one thing is not a secret. I disagree with this president's direction that he's taking the country. We can do a better job, and I intend to do it.
He's come pretty close. She was part of a team that successfully recorded part of the initiation ceremony that takes place in the tomb's courtyard.
Okay, you have the doorway here.
Yeah.
Okay, then to the right you have a hedge, and then
Yeah.
you have an evergreen tree. If you follow that line straight back, courtyard's in there.
Okay.
So
that's where they have the ceremonies in
the
there.
outdoor part of it was indoors. So we only got to see the outdoor part.
Right.
We only got to and to listen to the outdoor part. God only knows what went on indoors.
And what did you hear? What was it you know? You managed to get this unique
It was
access to it.
disgusting. It was gross. I mean, they were pretending to murder people.
What was the tone of it though? Was it jokey or was it
Vicious.
quite...
No, it wasn't jokey at all. It was sick. It's about the only way I can describe it. It was sick.
What you're hearing is the first recording ever made of the Skull and Bones initiation ceremony. It has never been broadcast before. 15 new members of the club are being introduced into the macabre rituals of Skull and Bones by the senior students who are about to graduate. The club has what some might see as a strange fascination with death, skulls and bones. There's the chants too, difficult to hear first of all, but including the devil equals death, and death equals death.
This is a huge problem with politics. However, if you think that the fields of science or theoretical science are somehow immune to the reaches of Freemasonic influence, then you are sadly mistaken. The overall field of theoretical science has been absolutely overtaken by the very clever covert elements of the higher-ups of the secret brotherhoods, ranging from those found in the Vatican to those found in the yards of Yale and other so-called prestigious universities. The indoctrination into the cult of scientism begins for us during our formative years. This approach is highly effective, for it creates a profound impression into our foundational understanding of reality. Our entire physical paradigm is based upon the underlying assumption that the world is a spinning ball in space, flying around in multiple directions at once. While this may not seem all that important at first glance, it is obvious to this writer that such a blatant misconstruing of reality acts as a primer for further mind control. If you can convince a youngster that Santa Claus delivers presents to every good Christian child in the world in a single night, you can convince them the Tooth Fairy flies into their room at night to snatch up their lost teeth and replace them with some fiat currency, and you can convince them, of course, that the Earth is a spinning ball in space. You can indeed convince them of anything. Now, I cannot condone such bizarre manipulation of children, but it has somehow become the societal norm to knowingly lie to our children about the Easter Bunny and all this other nonsense. somewhere along the line, certainly within the last 500 years or possibly less, not thousands of years as the Globers would have us believe, it became mandatory to teach all children about the globe Earth during a phase in our lives when we're so trusting of authority that all of us, with very few exceptions, are led to believe, hook, line, and sinker, that a 300-pound man who lives at the North Pole climbs down every single chimney in the Christian world to deliver presents in a single night. Now, if you do not think it's possible that you were tricked about the world being a spinning ball during this very same phase in your life, then you are, again, sadly mistaken. The fact of the matter is, we flat earthers have indeed skeptically revisited the topic of the spinning ball Earth, and indeed it is clearly and obviously a fairy tale, far more insidious and even unbelievable than the others mentioned, for nobody has been there, historically at least, to let everyone know that it's literally a pile of conjecture, and for all intents and purposes, infinite space actually doesn't exist. Just like Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, the spinning ball Earth, residing in the infinite vastness of space-time theory, is literally as real as the Easter Bunny. It is extremely difficult to reach people who are still within the control of the spell created by belief in the spinning ball Earth. Many natural phenomenon which raise logistical concerns with the spinning ball Earth theory have been contorted to somehow become feasible upon or even exclusive to a spinning ball Earth. For example, what goes up must come down is a natural phenomenon which, in all honesty, does not physically jive with the notion that the Earth is spinning upon an axis, faster than the speed of sound for most observers in the world. If you were hypothetically standing upon the side of a centrifuge, were you to somehow toss a ball up or away from the axis of rotation, the last thing you would expect to see would be that ball falling straight back down to the ground, or falling straight back down towards the axis of rotation. Even granting the theory of gravity for argument's sake, you would expect to see at least angular changes in the trajectory of such a ball due to what is essentially the Coriolis effect. But of course, one of the first things Globers will ask you as a flat earther is, okay, well, what causes objects to fall to the ground if the Earth isn't a spinning ball? This is somehow implying that when apples fall from trees, it is somehow natural evidence of the Earth's twirling sphericity. The ignorance and arrogance of this position approaches comical, although it is scary when it comes from perceived scientific authority figures.
What is gravity?
You have no idea. Okay, next question.
Wow.
No. And by the way, this is called gravity.
Neil, I gotta say, you're totally blowing my mind right now.
That's what I do. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, bitch.
What goes up must come down is something that simply doesn't make a lot of sense upon a spinning ball Earth. You need something like gravity to act as a physical attraction between the centrifuge Earth and wee little objects allegedly fixed to its sides. Gravity is alleged to be a warping of the theory of space-time, as the massive Earth essentially displaces the rectilinear fabric of physical space and hypothetical time. Gravity has never been measured, detected, or proven, unless of course you consider the conjecture of the scientists at LIGO, who convinced themselves that they witnessed gravity waves which originated some 1.3 billion years ago in a galaxy far, far away. Furthermore, the fact that objects fall to the ground at consistent velocities, regardless of the time of day, in spite of the Earth's alleged axial rotation and orbital motion, is excellent evidence against the motion of the Earth. When the sun is rising, it is alleged that the Earth is hurling up towards your feet at a staggering 666 miles an hour. 12 hours later, during sunset, the Earth should be moving in the opposite relative direction at 666 miles an hour, down away from your feet. Strangely, objects fall at the same rate and angle, regardless of the time of day. You would expect to see rockets launching strictly at sunset, for example, thus taking advantage of the Earth's natural trajectory, utilizing way less energy to reach so-called escape velocity relative to the Earth's trajectory, but that simply isn't the case. The simple truth is, what goes up must come down is something that makes perfect sense and jives perfectly on the flat Earth. The theory of gravity is only necessary if you make the wild and unfounded assumption that the world is a spinning ball flying around in space. The flat Earth reality is very simple, and the density of an object relative to the ambient atmosphere dictates whether it will rise or fall. 100 tons of steel will sink to the bottom of the ocean. The same 100 tons of steel will indeed float on the surface of the ocean if fashioned into a properly buoyant vessel. A hot air balloon will rise thousands of feet into the air, overcoming the alleged force of gravity simply by heating the air within the balloon. A weather balloon will rise to 20 plus miles simply by the buoyant force of the helium within. The density and temperature of these objects and contained gases dictate what altitude they will find their place of equilibrium and thus find their place of rest. A rock falls to the ground because it is more dense than the surrounding ambient atmosphere. So, while the fact that objects indeed fall to the ground is not exclusive to a spherical Earth, in fact, the spherical Earth requires a great deal of mental gymnastics to allow for the simple act of objects falling to the ground in a straight line when allowed to fall. This is, of course, because all centrifuges in nature generate a thrust away from the axis of rotation. And so if we are standing on the outside of a centrifuge, especially at the equator, we should all experience an outward thrust up and away from the axis of rotation. By this principle, a ton of coffee should weigh less at the equator than it does at the North Pole. Also, it would be very wise, as my friend Martin Ledke mentioned on Globebusters a couple weeks ago, that if the Earth was a spinning ball, it would make a lot of sense to buy commodities like, let's say, gold at the equator and sell that same commodity at the North Pole. Because, of course, this alleged centrifuge Earth should have some measurable effect on objects attached to its surface, with an enormous disparity in this centrifugal force between the equator and the poles. A simple experiment that anyone can do to prove this point is to find yourself 2 sets of dumbbells. One set, say, each 5 pounds, and the other set each is 10 pounds. Begin spinning with the dumbbells in each hand. Say, start with the 5-pound weights and leave your arms out to the sides. Spin as fast as you can, allowing the weights to tug up and out on your arms. Do that experiment with the 5-pound weight and again with the 10-pound weights, and you'll find that although if you're spinning at a consistent speed during both runs, the 10-pound weights will generate more outward thrust than the 5-pound weights. This is just simply how centrifugal forces work. This is due to the angular acceleration of the objects, being the weights in this example, and we ourselves, the observers, or say a ton of coffee or a ton of gold, should be adherent to this same principle of physics and nature. But of course, there is no measurable difference in this alleged centrifuge at the equator versus the pole. Now, it is claimed by Globers that there is some very minute measurable difference in an object's weight at these 2 locations, although it is not sufficient to explain the infinite difference between standing at the equator, where you're allegedly traveling east faster than the speed of sound at 1,000 miles an hour, while vertically descending along that curve over 100 miles in an hour. This spinning should also be compounded or made more complex by the alleged orbital velocity, because again, during the sunrise twilight, the Earth should be racing up towards your feet. During the sunset twilight, the Earth should be racing down and away from your feet. And during noon and midnight respectively, you would have well, everything in between. The Earth racing left to right under your feet at midnight, and of course the Earth racing right to left under your feet at noon. The Coriolis force is another such natural phenomenon which is claimed to exclusively prove the ball Earth. We observe cyclonic forces rotating in opposite directions depending on their hemisphere. Now, it is claimed that this is due to the spin of the Earth and the opposing Coriolis forces north and south of the equator. Now, it must be assumed, however, that no other explanation for this phenomenon is possible, which is, of course, not the case. In any model, the changing weather patterns, and yes, even the tides, are caused by the rising of temperature with the sun and the lowering of temperature at night, especially with a full moon. This flux in temperature in a cyclical nature creates a natural flux in pressure of the air and of the waters. Perhaps there is also some electromagnetic factor contributing to the tides, but it is not debatable that changes in temperature will certainly result in changes in barometric pressure as well as water pressure. Thus, sea level will fluctuate depending on temperature. At any rate, the Coriolis force is completely ignored when it comes to observations which categorically disagree with the ball Earth theory. For example, when an airplane takes off and accelerates west, the principles governing the Coriolis force dictate that such a plane will not retain its hypothetical rotational frame of reference, just as it did when the tires were planted firmly upon the runway. The Coriolis force demands that such an airplane would be traveling independent of the rotational direction of the Earth below, and regardless of the accompanying atmosphere, the airplane would be independent of the allegedly spinning Earth beneath. Jet airlines were designed with aerodynamics in mind, of course. This means that they are designed to maximize thrust and minimize drag. The claim that the Earth's atmosphere permanently binds westbound planes to the spinning ball Earth's reference frame is laughable. It is only because we see westbound flights that are sometimes identical in duration to their respective eastbound flights racing against the destinations that Globers must hold the position that westbound planes are permanently bound to the rotating Earth's frame of reference, constantly traveling east faster than the speed of sound, even though the plane takes off and heads west, traveling 500 miles an hour in the opposite direction. The level of ignorance needed to hold fast to this position is staggering, but again, it is necessary to preserve the belief in a spinning ball Earth. So it is this exact sort of cognitive dissonance which people exhibit when confronted with the facts that prevent people from seeing through the ball Earth lies. Circumnavigation is another item which is claimed to be exclusive to the ball Earth. Of course, when you take even a cursory look at the AE projection, you'll find that circumnavigation around a central magnetic North Pole is entirely possible upon a planar Earth. It doesn't take a sphere to travel around in a circle. It is exactly this sort of incongruent, illogical anti-science which is foisted upon us when we're in a life phase where we believe in leprechauns and unicorns. It is also claimed by Globers that since we can see further from higher elevations, the Earth is thus proven to be a globe. Anyone can do a simple experiment to disprove this notion. Find a place which you know is flat and lay on your belly. You'll see an optical horizon that is just a few feet away from you, and you wouldn't be able to see the ground comprising the, say, free throw line on the opposite end of a basketball court. If you then stand up and observe the same area around you, which you know to be flat, would you expect to see more of the area or less of the area compared to when you were lying flat on your belly? Of course you'd be able to see the entire area or more of the area compared to when you were on your belly. Does this prove that the flat area is now a sphere? Of course it doesn't. We can see further from higher because the ground acts as an impenetrable barrier to our line of sight. Our angle of attack towards the horizon increases with altitude. Thus, we can see a larger radius from higher elevations. It has nothing to do with the ball Earth. At the end of the day, all of the so-called evidence in support of a globe Earth is flimsy at best. The reason they hit us with the globe when we're so young is we'll basically believe anything purported to us with authority from some guiding figure in our lives. These authority figures are not willingly deceiving us. They too are a product of this mind control indoctrination and are thus participating in the Great Deception unwittingly. The staggering amount of evidence in support of a flat and motionless world leaves little room for doubt. The spinning ball Earth theory, including everything from infinite space to the Big Bang theory, is literally nonsense and fantasy and science fiction. Our culture is one that is utterly deceived about the very ground which we live upon, yet we're led to believe that we're the smartest, most technologically advanced civilization ever to grace the world with our presence. The modern prevailing mindset of capitalism and consumerism heavily relies upon the nihilist tendencies instilled within the masses via the infinite space theory. The only antidote for this cultural cancer is the truth, and the truth is the world is the only physical plane of its kind in reality, at least that we're aware of. There is nothing else in the known universe even remotely similar to the physical plane Earth and physical reality itself, and the lights in the night sky are merely a secondary feature of the physical plane itself, not potential destinations once we've ruined this world. So that wraps up this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching. As always, this channel is viewer supported, so if you'd like to make a contribution through PayPal or Patreon, I'll put the links up here. Thanks so much for your support. God bless you guys, and as always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace out, everybody.